I recently saw the hit movie Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, and after indulging the 1 hour and 47 minutes of what felt like the film trying to antagonise me, it got me thinking. About a question as old as time, discussed as much as the Bible itself: should video games be adapted into movies or TV shows? It's something that I mentioned very briefly in my first Arcane video, and I want to expand upon it here. There are so many video games that have been rumoured to be adapted into movies, with the two of the more heavy ones being Red Dead Redemption and Bioshock. Like, yeah, great, butchered two more of my favourite franchises, why don't you? Now, disregarding all of that, there are three main cases that I wish to look at. The good, the bad and the ugly, if you will, because to me they each represent how a video game adaptation will turn out, starting off at the bottom of the barrel with Resident Evil. Now, I am a die-hard Resident Evil fan. I started off a few years ago with Resident Evil 1, the remake, and I've loved it ever since, especially Resident Evil 4 and Village. Now, there have been countless attempts to translate Resi to the big screen, beginning with Resident Evil 2002, probably the best live-action Resident Evil movie ever made, but is it actually good? I wouldn't say so. Look, I know there are quite a few that like the Anderson movies, but I am most certainly not one of them. But I could appreciate the first one because despite its low budget and small scale story, the movie manages to translate the core of the game's vibe to a somewhat enjoyable sci-fi action movie. Granted, the CG is aged about as well as milk, but what film from that era hasn't? Apocalypse was next to follow, and unlike its predecessor, this movie attempted to bring the lore over from the games into this universe, and whilst its attempt isn't terrible, I would much rather watch Infinite Darkness start to finish than this mess. Okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh, nothing is as bad as... well, we'll get to that. With all due respect, and I mean that very insincerely, there is nothing that this movie has to offer apart from Nemesis, who, well, credit where it's due, is quite cool. I do kinda like how they wrote him, and the fact that they did him practically is something that I really admire. But when it comes to actually fighting, he is very questionable, considering he's a bioweapon and all that. Whenever he fights anyone other than Alice, he literally never misses and he's like Prime Hawkeye or John Wick, but when he does fight Alex, he becomes an actual stormtrooper. But plot armor, right, I get it. So Apocalypse was another bust. Along comes Extinction to complete the trilogy, and good lord. After Apocalypse made an attempt to tie into the games, Extinction throws all of that out the window. And it's like, yeah, fine. If you don't want to tie into the games, then I get it, whatever. I wouldn't have minded a separate universe, but you've got to make your mind up. It felt like the Star Wars sequel trilogy in the sense that they clearly did not have a plan and they just winged it. But in many ways, Extinction sums up the thought process of many directors when they're given the task of making a video game tie-in. Do they connect it to the game itself or establish a separate universe? And herein lies the main problem. This is what I'm building to. The main issue with video game tie-ins is trying to, or not trying to, connect them to the lore that the games have established. If you connect it to the games, then the general audience of people who haven't played the games probably won't have a clue as to what's going on, but if you don't connect it to the games and make an entirely separate story, plot, cast of characters, etc., then fans of that particular series are going to be upset. It's a lose-lose situation. But going back to Extinction, it might as well not have the Resident Evil tagline attached to it. You see a few recognisable characters like Claire and Wesker, but like most incredible characters from the game universe, they're pushed to the side, so who cares? Right, how many more of these shit shows do I have to cover? 3? And the next one is Afterlife? God help me. Okay, right, I'm not saying Afterlife is terrible or the worst one because, well, it isn't, but Christ, it is a painful watch, and here is where Paul Anderson's lack of Resident Evil knowledge is made clear. Las Plagas are introduced, but since Paul Anderson hasn't the foggiest about what they are or what they do, he just makes them normal zombies. Seriously? You have the main conflict of Resident Evil 4, one of the greatest and most critically acclaimed pieces of media ever made, in your hands, and that's the most you can do? You're starting to see why I hate these movies now? When you have the Resident Evil universe in your control, and this is the most interesting thing you can do with it, then I'm sorry, but you have failed. Alright, next up is Retribution, and its plot that completely undermines events of Afterlife, and also kills Chris Redfield off screen.
What? How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
Excuse me? How can you... You know what? I'm just going to try and focus on the plot here before I have a brain aneurysm. But unfortunately, the plot in question is one of the weakest I've ever seen. Like, Alice meets up with another group of survivors to stop Wesker's evil plans, and they're there. At this point, I couldn't care less about what concoction Anderson has crafted this time because they were all made in a lab in an effort to spite Resident Evil fans. At least Ada is cool, but that isn't saying a whole lot because she's cool in everything, so if they'd have messed her up then we would have had a problem. And now, onto the final chapter. And right, this one offends me. Leon S. Kennedy, Ada Wong, and Jill Valentine are all killed off screen. That one move alone is an absolute crime. Right, so we've established that the final chapter was a catastrophe. But are any of the animated projects nearly as bad as it? No, but there is one that made me want to cry. To start this off, let's start at the beginning of the animated movies with Degeneration, and this one is... decent? It doesn't do anything too interesting or unique, but manages to be better than all of the Anderson movies, and would you look at that, it's connected to the game universe. What a fucking revolutionary idea. There's a cool scene with a callback to RE2, and this is more like it. I'm not saying that you need 500,000 references and to have your audience drowning in fan service, because if you try a bit too hard it can turn out like this, but if you do it correctly, it can turn out like this. I also like how Claire uses an umbrella in this scene, very ironic. But you see, when you've got little details like this, it shows that you care and understand both the characters and universe that you've been handed. Degeneration is a true follow-up to the events in Raccoon City. Like I said, it doesn't do anything major, nor is it a masterpiece, but it's good enough, which is all it really had to be. So they followed that up with Damnation, which for me is the most forgettable animated movie I've probably ever seen, but it's not bad. It tries to tell the story of biowarfare bad, but never does anything interesting with it. Ada returns and she's cool as hell, but again, well isn't she, but enough simping for a fictional character, onto Vendetta, which, truth be told, I'm torn over. This probably isn't going to go over that well, but for me it's the best Resident Evil movie ever made, and yeah, it's not exactly got stiff competition, but I enjoyed this one. Going to be pretty bold here, but this movie has some of the best action I have ever seen from an animated film. There, I said it. But hence the reason I'm torn over it. It doesn't exactly scream Resident Evil, the lack of horror is very noticeable, but going back to the positives, the action is great and we get to see Rebecca again. God damn it, here, take my 5-star rating. But the dialogue does take 10 years off my life, which is a shame because the voice actors all do a fine job. Also, Rebecca near the end is relegated to doing absolutely nothing after getting kidnapped, and that's my biggest issue with Vendetta, mainly because the main villain isn't exactly well written to say the least, and the action does kind of save it. Oh, moving on. I'm not spending too long on Infinite Darkness, mainly due to the fact that it's abysmal.
Why are you the way that you are? I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
The words boring and generic don't even begin to describe it. Honestly, it's just 112 minutes of absolute misery. I know this got quite a bit of praise, but I would like to know which show they were watching. So we'll pretend it never happened, and finally, the moment we've been waiting for is Welcome to Raccoon City, the first good Resident Evil movie. No, this fucking sucks. It's not completely woeful. Each and every actor does a fine job with what they're given, especially Robbie Amell, Kayla Scodelario, Neil McDonough and Tom Hopper, but it was a painful watch at times. Wesker was quite interested and he's hyped up to be this big bad, but eventually he betrays them by running 5 minutes ahead of them and then getting clapped. Yeah, what a great villain. If anything, I just ended up feeling sorry for the guy, and I'm not sure whether that was intentional or not. But again, in its defense, the movie's not completely terrible. The Spencer Mansion section was quite good, but the rest just seems so out of place. Also, it seems like they had the budget of a YouTube video. If they'd have just focused on making the first movie about the first game, without trying to cram in the second game, then maybe we'd have got something. Hearing Jill actually utter the words Jill sandwich for no fucking reason other than to try and reference RE1 made my skin crawl. Also, I love how they just left out Barry and completely butchered the character of Leon. I must have missed it when he was always portrayed as an idiot who didn't know his ass from his elbow. Again, I wouldn't mind if this was supposed to be a separate universe with nothing to do with the games, but the studio boasted about how the script was so faithful to the games, so did I miss something? I hope and pray to God that they do not make a sequel and we all just pretend this movie ever happened. Sound good? Good. Welcome to Raccoon City is a total dumpster fire, yet I'd still rather watch it over any of the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. Time to talk about yet another franchise near and dear to my heart, Silent Hill. The first 3 Silent Hill games are undisputed masterpieces, with Silent Hill 2 being the absolute peak of horror. Now, I could sit here and kiss this game's ass for days, but what else could I say that hasn't already been said? What do you say about Silent Hill 2? That it's a masterpiece? That it's the most well-conceived and executed video game ever made? That every detail of it dovetails into every other in a legitimately perfect story? That the acting is the best in any video game ever? These things are all true, we all know it, everybody knows it, it's Silent Hill 2. But what I'm getting at, with the amount of heart and soul that was poured into the trilogy, why couldn't the movies get the same love? You're probably wondering why I'm slandering it since I've put it a tier above Resident Evil. First of all, that's not a high bar to beat. Second of all, the first movie is surprisingly competent. Just like the games that inspired it, the movie features 3 different layers of reality, but unlike the games, it has less than wonderful plot. Rose and Chris De Silva's adopted daughter Sharon has recurrent nightmares about a ghost town. She sleepwalks and repeats the name of Silent Hill. When her condition keeps getting worse, Rose decides to take Sharon to Silent Hill, West Virginia, to get to the root of the problem instead of, literally anywhere else. So I'd say the setup is not bad, but the rest just kind of drones on. They could have made it so much more simple, but all things considered, the film wasn't bad. The imagery, the cinematography, soundtrack, atmosphere, decent for the most part. Christoph Gans tried, he really did, more than I can say for Anderson, but if I were them, I'd have just made Sean be in the star of the movie looking for his daughter in Silent Hill, keep it simple. Pyramid Head elevates every scene he's in, just like in the games, but he isn't nearly as menacing as he's in the game. Then again, he does tear a woman's skin off with his bare hands, so see that how you will. Overall, the movie had little to do with the games, but it manages to craft its own somewhat respectable universe. But it did kind of disappoint me, despite many claiming it to be the greatest video game adaptation ever made. Again, it's not got the stiffest of competition, but do I agree? It's a tough one. It's definitely one of the best, but the best is a bold claim. But, let's defend it further. It's got an eerie and depressing feel throughout, which works in its favour, and both Pyramid Head and the nurses are well done. But I just wish they were both used a bit more. Just let me flip the switch a bit. One thing it does prove is how important pacing is in movies. It's around 2 hours in length, yet it felt a hell of a lot longer. Just bear with me here. A good example of pacing is Zack Snyder's Justice League. A bit off topic, I know, but that movie is 4 hours long, yet it doesn't feel like it's over 2, because the pacing is done right. Yet the 2-hour Silent Hill movie managed to take about 20 years off my life, but the sequel, oh boy, it took about 50 years off of it. Okay, so the 2006 debut Silent Hill movie has done the bare minimum and earns a sequel. Surely they could improve upon the first. The season 8 finale of Game of Thrones exists, and yet it's still not the most embarrassing thing Kit Harington has ever appeared in. Because of this. Many call this the worst video game movie adaptation ever made. Do I agree with such a bold claim? I don't know. But I still don't hate this nearly as much of 90% of the Anderson Resident Evil movies. But yeah, Revelation is a total dumpster fire, but for what it's worth, I really liked Adelaide Clemens as Heather, who is my favourite character in the history of Silent Hill, so that probably helped. But at the same time, this movie completely breaks Silent Hill lore. Heather doesn't even say it's bread once. Disgusting. But for me, it's kind of a so bad it's good movie. But make no mistake, at its core, this movie is horrible. Not only is this movie bad, but it did the cardinal sin of making Pyramid Head a good guy who fights for the power of love, and that is not something I will ever forgive them for. But I wasn't disappointed with Revelation because I had little to no expectations going in. Expect disappointment and you'll never be disappointed, right? Alright, enough negativity. Time to talk about something good. Like, really good. So far, we've had 2 less than inspired adaptations of loved video game franchises, so let's flip the switch and have a masterpiece of an adaptation based on one of the most hated video games of all time. And you already know what I'm talking about, it's Arcane. I've made 2 videos prior to this where I kissed this show's ass more than you can possibly imagine, but it is so applicable here. I don't think it's a popular opinion to say that Arcane is the best video game adaptation ever made. In fact, it's probably common knowledge at this point, but I'll explain it for anyone unfamiliar with it. Well, that and the fact that I'll take any excuse I can get to talk about this even further. I'll try not to repeat any points I've already made. What makes Arcane so compelling over the course of its first season is the characters and the relationships that they have with each other. You can tell that they really cared when making this, more than I can say for any other video game adaptation that I've ever seen. Relationships drive everything in the show. First, it's about Vi and Powder, who, across the first 3 episodes, grow up together as sisters orphaned by war. They're taken in, and an abundance of mistakes lead to the death of their adopted father. There's so much more to it than that, but that is it simplified. If you want the full rundown, I'll put the link in the description for the 2 videos that I made on Arcane. I heavily suggest watching them. Unlike Vi and Powder, Jace and Victor aren't the same, if you will, mainly because Victor is from the Undercity, whereas Jace is from Topside. Their success doesn't corrupt either of them necessarily, but from what I gathered from my 3rd watch through of the show is that Arcane's writers are so much more interested in complicated people instead of inherently good or bad. Now, you may not want to hear this, but it helps that League of Legends had no story to begin with, so they couldn't piss off hardcore fans unless they got certain personalities very wrong. Now, I'm not saying that as a negative. I mean, just look at the Street Fighter movie. There's no coherent story to that, or there wasn't at the time, yet that movie was still an abomination. So, whilst Riot had a much easier job than most other companies when it came down to it, that's not to say it was easy, because they still had to craft a banger of the story, and that's exactly what they did. Something I particularly liked about the narrative is that it's not a show that's particularly concerned with world building by way of exposition, and rather it shows characters building the world, and well, breaking it. But it prioritises showing rather than telling, which I love so much, because one of my biggest pet peeves is when shows or movies or whatever tell you something bad has happened, rather than showing you. It's why Silco is such a good villain. He isn't some generic mustache twirling baddie. We aren't told about his antics, we witnessed them firsthand. Such as when he kidnapped and then stabbed fan favourite character Vander through the back. The main villain in this show is awesome, unlike the main villains of almost every video game adaptation, where you simply couldn't care less if this hero overcomes them. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent. Point is, this show does not fall into traps that most video game tie-ins fall into. It does not indulge in weightless and mindless action. Its fights are all very stylish, well choreographed and meaningful. Characters don't just walk away from fights bloody, they walk away different. Thank you once again for listening to the ramblings of a madman that has gone on way too long, but I really just wanted to get a few things off my chest after the frustration and disappointment of Welcome to Raccoon City, because I felt like it was wasted potential, yet I hope they stop making video game adaptations because they're usually woeful. Maybe I've been a bit too harsh on the ones I've mentioned here. I could have brought up ones like Super Mario Bros, Street Fighter, Doom and Assassin's Creed. Jesus, those were bad, but I felt like the 3 that I chose represented the 3 types of video game adaptations. The 3 horsemen, if you will. But speaking of pain, the wait for Arcane Season 2 is going to kill me, but getting to talk about it more was pretty nice, even if I had to cover some dog dirt before that. If you agreed with what I had to say here, or even if you didn't, then feel free to drop a comment explaining your thoughts on this video and video game adaptations in general. And if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, it really helps me out. And yeah, that's about all I have to say. Speak to you soon.